One of the main complaints that people have with politics, not just in Australia, but broadly, and especially in the United States, is the idea that money wins elections. That people who raise enough money, people that outraise their competition and spend more, are the ones who are probably going to win in most cases. But a state in Australia has taken the bold step to almost completely outlaw campaign fundraising and political contributions to political parties. The state in question is South Australia, which currently has a Labor government led by Peter Malinauskas. And his story is particularly interesting, and it's quite fascinating how he came to this perspective that political donations needed to be outlawed. And I highly recommend that you go watch his interview with 7:30 on the ABC recently, because it's quite an astounding story. Long before Peter ever became Premier, back in 2014, he was in the United States and got to witness an American midterm election. Obama was president, the Republicans were healthily controlling Congress, and Peter was quite disgusted by what he saw because the degree to which money influences American politics, for at least for an outsider's perspective, is absolutely insane. The biggest takeaway and area of concern for Peter was not just how much money was going into politics in America, but how it affected congressmen and women in the House of Representatives. And John Oliver, I think, did a great piece on this a couple of years ago, but looking at how politicians actually have to function on a day-to-day basis when money is so important. According to Peter himself, he said that he witnessed congresspeople spending 80% of their time in office attending fundraisers and trying to get more money. That's how much time they have to devote, not to their constituents, not to passing legislation, but rather to trying to scrape together enough money so that they can run their next campaign. So the question that this brought to the forefront of Peter's mind, and more broadly to Labor in South Australia, is how do you ensure that when you get elected representatives, they're not devoting almost all of their time to getting re-elected and fundraising and subsequently becoming completely disconnected from their constituents? Well, this is a controversial idea, but if you're one of my American viewers, this is something that Bernie Sanders actually suggested during his presidential runs, and that is the idea that political campaigns are almost, if not entirely, funded by the government. Now, if I have any libertarian followers at the moment, I'm sure they're probably trying not to throw up in their mouths at the idea of that, but at its core, this idea of the government funding campaigns for political parties and independents really comes from this core idea that if you just let private interests massively invest in elections, that itself is inherently corrupt and to some extent is unacceptable. For democracy to function properly and well, there needs to be some guarantee that there is a fair and level playing field, and not that one side of politics is backed by millionaires and massive corporate interests, or in the case of South Australia, potentially union interests. This is about ensuring and promising the South Australian people that when they are going out and they are voting, the reason that parties have the funding that they do is because they are successful and actually manage good relationships with their voters, rather than just because they have massive multi-million-dollar backers. So how is this going to work in practice, the funding? Well, the basic idea is political candidates, regardless of where they're from or whether they're independent or part of a party, will receive electoral funding based on how well they perform as it relates to their primary vote. And how much you get paid for your primary vote will also be based on what category of candidate you fall into. Either you fall into one of four categories. An established political party, that refers to someone running with a political party that has representation in Parliament. A non-establishment party, that's any new political party or party that doesn't have a seat in either house of the South Australian Parliament. Incumbent independents, so any independent that holds a seat in either house. And then non-incumbent independents. So essentially people running these independents who aren't currently in the Parliament. So I've got the numbers up there, but I'm also looking at them. I don't want to get the specifics of it wrong. But the first group is established political parties, people running with one of four political parties in South Australia. Currently, only four political parties have representation in either house in South Australia. That is the Liberal Party, the Labor Party, the Greens, and SA Best. And if you don't know what SA Best is, it is basically what is left of Nick Xenophon's political movement. He kind of faltered out and his political career came to an end around 2018, but he did get some members to South Australia's upper house. And I think there's only one left now because a few of them left the party, but there's one member of SA Best in South Australia's upper house who will fall into that category along with the Liberals, the Greens, and the Labor Party. That next group there, non-established political parties, they'll get paid out basically on a tiered system, as it were. So let's take One Nation, for example. They don't have any representation in South Australia's parliament. If they were running a candidate in any given electoral division in South Australia and they got 15% of the vote, for that first 10% of the vote that they received, for their next campaign, they'll receive $6 per vote. But for that next 5% of their total of 15% of the primary vote, they will get $5.50 as if they were an established political party. This is essentially an anti-incumbency bias in the system, so that political parties that are just dipping their toes into the water or trying to get into politics get paid out at a higher rate from the start, but once they go beyond 10% and are clearly establishing themselves well, that initial advantage they have will go away and they'll just get paid out at the same rate that the major parties would. Now we get into independent candidates, and this is a very interesting shift because this new scheme of paying massively incentivizes independents to run and ensures that their campaigns get the biggest return on their investment. By that I mean their time investment. They get the most out to run their next campaign. The logic here being that if somebody is good enough and popular enough locally to be elected as an independent to state parliament, that person deserves to have their campaign funded. And if somebody is getting off the ground and is running a very successful campaign to try and get into parliament, you want to encourage that type of political engagement in the system. To give you a sense of how beneficial this is for independent politicians in South Australia, let's take a look at the safest seat in South Australia, and that is the division of Cavill, which is currently represented by an independent by the name of Dan Cregan. And he won the seat on a primary vote of about 50%, and that equals about 12,000 votes. Because of the rate at which independents are paid for their primary votes, Mr. Cregan is going to receive $100,000 from the state government to run his campaign next year. Now, of course, there is probably some political manoeuvring in this. If the South Australian Labor Party wanted to keep independents in both the House and the Legislative Council happy, this is certainly a way that they have achieved it. Now, of course, this legislation does not get rid of all campaigning by independent groups, like lobbies and such. Groups can still run political campaigns, attack ads and such like that, but they are limited per campaign to $450,000. So if a mining lobby or a union group wants to run negative ads about any political party, they can do so, but they can only spend about $500,000 in those campaigns. So you'll probably see a lot less negative advertising in campaigns because, of course, these companies and interest groups will keep spending their money to run attack ads or support ads for any political party, but they'll do so at a rate much lower than it was before. Of course, $450,000 is still a lot of money, but Peter himself, I think, put it best when he said, it's certainly better than that money previously being unlimited. Okay, so big reflection point. Who are the winners and losers in this legislation? Well, first off, losers, I think the biggest losers here are special interest groups. Groups that previously would donate heaps of money to political campaigns to ensure that one side or another won. So the logic for politicians now is not going to be what will keep my fundraisers happy. They're going to be thinking now, how do I get the most votes and the most support from my community? Because my next campaign is going to be based entirely on how well I actually do in the election, not how much I can butter up or support some random rich executive in the state. Also, I think there is an argument to be made to some extent, the Greens have been hurt for this. Because look, this legislation is really good for independents and really good for parties that have just been formed or aren't in Parliament, but it can hurt that middle of the range party where there is representation in either chamber, and therefore they qualify as an official party, but they don't necessarily have the amount of seats in Parliament to be considered influential. So look, this might hurt the Greens, but I don't think it's that damaging. Elections in South Australia aren't that big, if we're being honest. Most divisions only have around 22 to 27,000 voters, so you don't need a massive campaign to get your message out there. I mean, take a look at the seat of Hayson, for example. In 2022, they had the highest amount of Green support in terms of raw votes, just shy of 5,000. That's translating to the Greens in that seat to almost $30,000 in campaign funding that will be given to them by the government, which is nothing to hold your nose at. And while I'm on the subject of these minor parties that are represented in Parliament, the other, I guess, elephant in the room would be SA Best. And I'm not entirely sure how that's going to work out. I'm very interested to see this because it's a tricky situation and I haven't got a definitive answer from reading the legislation. And SA Best, a quick look back on it, was established to run in basically the 2018 South Australian election by Nick Xenophon to try and disrupt the two-party system. Didn't really work, but he got some members elected to the upper house to 8-year terms. One of them has defected and is now just an independent in the upper house. He's considering joining with the Liberals. But there's one MP left. I believe her name is Connie something. Connie Bernardo. She is the only member left of the SA Best party in South Australia's parliament. And that's interesting because is she entitled to the totality of the electoral funding that SA Best would be owed? Because it's unbelievable. They went from the third party in South Australian politics in terms of support to basically not existing. So if this is applied to her entirely as the one person that has held onto the brand and the leader of the SA Best party, she alone will get over $1 million to run her re-election campaign, or rather the campaign for SA Best, but realistically just her campaign. So that is something that I think we should all keep an eye on to see how that pans out. But back to winners and losers, of course, I think the South Australian people are the big winners in this, if we are being perfectly honest. I mean, this, I think, is going to be monumental. There are some concerns to be had about what this means for minor parties, but the fact that it is going to be so much more transparent in how parties get their campaign financing and how they ensure that they can run their campaigns. The fact that that is now a question of how well they perform and how much the community at large likes them, as opposed to how much they can get support from special interest groups, is a monumental improvement for the broader state of democracy. Is this something that I would like to see applied in other states? Absolutely. It would be a lot more difficult at a federal level, but I still think it is absolutely something that is worth looking into. Imagine what the Liberal Party at a federal level would look like without the funding and the campaign influence of someone like Gina Rinehart or the mining industry. So I'm very much looking forward to the 2026 South Australian state election, because this is going to be the first election in Australian history that is effectively entirely run without the campaign influence of funding from special interests. Of course, like, they'll still be running their negative campaigns, but it won't be going directly to candidates. And I think that is a massive step forward when it comes to electoral reform. Thank you for listening to this, guys. If I've made any mistakes in the legalese and the specifics of the legislation, please let me know. My forte, or at least I like to think it's my forte, is discussing politics and trying to break down more complicated topics for the people that follow me. And I really enjoy doing that, but I'm not a perfect legal expert, so if I've misread anything from the legislation specifically, and you are much more knowledgeable on the actual wording of the bill that has just been passed, please let me know in the comments down below. But thank you for sticking around for this long. We are on the cusp of 30,000 subscribers, and that would, it's hard to even begin to explain how much I didn't expect to make it this far. So, as I always say, or try to always say at the end of this, thank you guys for your support as always. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this in the comments down below, and I will see you guys in the next video.